9 years cleaning rooms she wasn't allowed to sit in. 9 years serving men, none of whom remembered her face. And in a single night, it all changed. 6 families ruled the underworld, 6 names powerful enough to strike fear into the government. They saw her walk into the banquet hall and rise. Not for power, not for beauty, but for a name they'd been searching for 20 years. Like and comment the city you're viewing to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't go anywhere, because tonight, the truth won't leave her alone. The dress didn't fit right. That was the first thing Alara noticed when Mrs. Hargrove shoved it into her arms. A floor-length gown the color of old gold, with a structured bodice and a skirt that fanned out like something from a different century. It had been made for a woman 3 inches taller and 10 pounds lighter, and it showed. The zipper caught at Alara's ribs. The hem dragged when she walked. She stood in front of the narrow mirror in the staff corridor and looked at herself and felt nothing she could name. "It'll have to do," Mrs. Hargrove said. She wasn't looking at Alara. She was looking at her clipboard. "I don't understand what I'm supposed to do," Alara said. "Escort duty, the ceremonial kind." Mrs. Hargrove finally glanced up, and her expression carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who had stopped explaining things to people she considered beneath explanation. "Miss Villeneuve had an accident. Twisted ankle on the west staircase, they're saying. Maybe something worse. Either way, she won't be presenting tonight." "I'm a maid." "You have a face and you can walk. Tonight, that's sufficient." Alara looked back at the mirror. The woman in the gold dress looked back at her. Dark circles under brown eyes, a jaw set too hard for a formal occasion, hair pulled up in a way that Mrs. Hargrove had done herself in under 3 minutes and called good enough. There was a small scar below Alara's left cheekbone that she'd had as long as she could remember. The dress didn't hide it. Nothing did. "The guests," she started. "You don't speak to the guests unless spoken to. You stand at the entrance to the ballroom, you present the program cards, you smile if you can manage it, and you disappear when the formal introductions are done." Mrs. Hargrove tucked her clipboard under her arm. "You've worked this estate for 9 years, Alara. You know how invisible you are. Tonight, be exactly that invisible, just in a nicer dress." She left. The corridor went quiet except for the distant sound of the Blackthorn Estate's heating system knocking somewhere in the walls. Alara pressed her thumb against the scar on her cheek, a habit she'd had forever, though she couldn't have said why. She walked toward the ballroom. The Blackthorn Estate sat on 46 acres of manicured grounds, at the edge of a city that had long since learned not to ask too many questions about who owned what out here. The main house was 3 stories of dark stone and iron, built in an era when wealth announced itself through sheer mass. In 9 years of working its halls, Alara had learned its rhythms the way you learn the breathing of a sleeping animal, the hours when the east wing grew cold, the precise angle of afternoon light that made the main staircase marble glow amber, which floorboards to avoid after midnight. She knew the estate better than almost anyone alive. She did not know who the guests were tonight. The staff had been told very little, which was itself a kind of information. When the estate hosted normal wealthy gatherings, charity boards, corporate retreats, the occasional political fundraiser, the staff received detailed briefings, guest lists, dietary restrictions. Tonight, nothing. Just a mandatory presence requirement, a uniform inspection that morning, and the specific instruction that no staff member was to make eye contact with any guest without explicit invitation to do so. Standing now at the threshold of the corridor that opened into the ballroom's antechamber, Alara could hear it, a sound unlike any event she'd worked before. Not the bright noise of people enjoying themselves. Something lower. Something that moved through the air at a frequency closer to threat than celebration. She stopped walking. Through the partially open door ahead, she could see the edge of the ballroom. Marble floors she had mopped herself 2 days ago, chandeliers that cost more than she would earn in 40 years, round tables dressed in white linen, and the people seated at them. She'd been in enough rooms with powerful people to recognize the texture of that kind of power. But this was different. This wasn't the manufactured gravity of politicians or the performative menace of executives who'd never actually bled for anything. This was the real kind, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. 6 tables, 6 distinct groupings of men and women who did not look at each other's tables directly, the way predators avoid direct eye contact when they're not yet ready to fight. Each group orbited a central figure who sat with the particular stillness of someone who had survived long enough to stop performing stillness. Alara didn't know their names. She would learn them, but not yet. Move. A hand on her shoulder, one of the senior event coordinators, a man named Darvish, who had never once in 9 years used her name. He pressed a small stack of ivory program cards into her hands. Antechamber, now. They're about to open the formal entry. She moved. The antechamber was a high-ceilinged room that served as a buffer between the estate's main entrance and the ballroom proper. It had 2 sets of double doors, ornate crown molding, a floor that was a different shade of marble from the ballroom and always slightly cold. Alara had cleaned this room hundreds of times. She knew the way sound behaved in here, how footsteps echoed differently depending on how many people were present, how the acoustics changed when both sets of doors were opened simultaneously. She stood to the right of the inner doors, program cards in hand, and waited. The outer doors opened at precisely 8 o'clock. The first guests through were security, large men in dark suits who swept the antechamber with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this sweep in 100 different rooms and never once found it unnecessary. They clocked Alara, dismissed her, moved on. Then the guests. They came in groups of 4 or 5, each cluster distinct, each carrying that particular gravity she'd seen through the door. Up close, it was more specific. An older man with white hair and a surgical scar along his jaw, flanked by 2 younger men who moved in perfect synchronization with him. A woman in her 50s in a charcoal suit, accompanied by a man Alara's age with a watchful, flat expression. Others she didn't have time to catalog properly, and she was distributing program cards, keeping her eyes appropriately lowered, doing the job. Most of them took the cards without acknowledgement. 1 or 2 glanced at her. No one spoke to her. She was invisible. It was fine. It was what she was supposed to be. Then the inner ballroom doors opened to admit the assembled guests, and from somewhere behind her there was a crash. Not catastrophic, but sharp. A tray of glassware going down somewhere off to the left. The sound pulled every head in the antechamber toward it for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Alara felt something. A prickle. The back of her neck, between her shoulder blades. The specific sensation of being watched by someone who wasn't looking at the noise. She turned. A man standing near the far wall had not turned toward the crash. He was still looking at her. Mid-60s, lean, iron-gray hair, swept back from a face that carried its age like something earned rather than suffered. He wore a dark suit with no tie. His eyes were dark and very still. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked through the inner doors into the ballroom. Alara's thumb found the scar on her cheek. She distributed the last of the program cards. Darvish appeared at her elbow and gestured her through the inner doors. She had been in the ballroom during events before, clearing glasses, replacing floral arrangements, the 1,000 small invisible tasks that kept a formal room functioning. She knew how to move through a crowded space without registering in anyone's peripheral vision. She'd spent 9 years perfecting it. She walked to her assigned position near the east wall, between a floral arrangement and a service station, and stood. The formal proceedings began. A man at the front of the room, not one of the 6 central figures, a facilitator of some kind, spoke briefly about the occasion in vague terms that said nothing. Alara caught words like convergence and mutual consideration and the annual renewal of understanding, which told her that whatever this gathering actually was, its public face had been carefully sanded down to meaninglessness. 30 minutes in, one of the serving staff, a young man named Clem, who'd started 8 months ago and still moved with the jerky anxiety of someone who hadn't yet internalized the estate's rhythms, was crossing the room with a tray of champagne flutes when his heel caught the edge of a chair leg. He didn't fall, but the tray tilted, and 3 glasses left it, and without processing what she was doing, Alara was already moving. 2 quick steps, hand out, catching 2 of the 3 glasses before they reached the floor. The third shattered. She straightened, set the 2 surviving glasses on the nearest table, and stepped back to her position. It took perhaps 4 seconds. She became aware of the silence only after she was back in place, not the silence of a room that hadn't noticed something, the silence of a room that had very much noticed. She looked up. The man with the iron gray hair, the one from the antechamber, was watching her again. But he wasn't the only one. At the nearest large table, a man in his 60s with heavy, formal features and a thick gold watch had gone completely still, his champagne glass halfway to his mouth. Beside him, a younger woman, his daughter, maybe, or a colleague, had pressed one hand flat against the tablecloth as if bracing herself. At the table to the left, a bald man with a deep complexion and an immaculate white suit had pushed his chair back slightly, as though he needed more room to look at her clearly. She held 6 stares. Not all at once, sequentially, as her eyes moved across the room in the way they always did when she felt exposed, cataloging exits, assessing threats, locating the fastest path to somewhere else. It was a habit she'd never thought much about. The facilitator at the front of the room had stopped speaking. Clem appeared at her elbow. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "The chair—" "It's fine," she said quietly. "Get back to your station." He went. She stayed. The man with the iron gray hair rose from his seat. That alone would have been enough to pull attention. He was clearly one of the 6 central figures. The way he moved, the way the people around him oriented themselves in response, the particular quality of authority that preceded him like a pressure change. When a man like that stood, rooms noticed. But then the man with the gold watch stood, and then the bald man in white. And then, table by table, the other 3 central figures, a woman with close-cropped silver hair and ice-colored eyes, a heavy-set man with a deeply lined face and an expression Alara couldn't read, a younger man, perhaps 40, who had the coiled stillness of someone who fought for a living and had won enough times to stop fearing it. 6 people. 6 of the most dangerous people in the room, standing, looking at her. The silence in the ballroom had become a physical thing. Alara was aware of the weight of it against her skin, the way it pressed against her eardrums. Somewhere in her chest, her heartbeat had shifted into something faster, harder, with a quality she couldn't categorize. Not quite fear, not quite recognition, not quite either. The man with the iron gray hair spoke first. His voice carried without effort, the way voices do when they've spent decades not needing to raise themselves to be obeyed. "Welcome home," he said. A pause. 2 of the other standing figures exchanged a single glance, confirming something between them. Then, one by one, the others spoke the same 2 words. "Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home." And then, because apparently this night had decided that nothing was going to remain inside the boundaries of anything Alara Ashcroft could process or contain, the iron gray man said, quietly but clearly, so that the entire frozen room could hear, "Little angel." Alara did not move. She was aware of the program card she was no longer holding. She was aware of the cold marble under the thin soles of the dress shoes Mrs. Hargrove had found her. She was aware of the scar beneath her left cheekbone where her thumb wanted to go, and she would not let it. She had never heard that name before. She was absolutely certain of that. And she was absolutely certain, with a sureness that had no logical foundation and no memory attached to it, that something in the marrow of her bones knew exactly what it meant. The chandelier above the center of the room swayed. Later, she would understand that the swaying was the first indication. The vibration transmitted through the ceiling before the sound followed. But in the moment, all she registered was motion at the periphery of her upward vision, the massive iron and crystal fixture shifting on its mount, and underneath that a sound she identified not from experience, but from instinct. The specific wrong metallic groan of a load-bearing cable under sudden lateral stress. The cable was failing. She was already moving before the thought finished forming. The serving station to her left held a set of knives, decorative, ostensibly, the kind used for formal cheese presentations, but real steel, real edges. Her hand found one. Her feet found the angle. The calculation happened somewhere below conscious thought. Trajectory, distance, the precise point on the chandelier support cable that was bearing the wrong load. The knife left her hand. The cable parted cleanly. The chandelier dropped 6 inches, then caught on its secondary support, which held. Crystal rattled. One pendant broke free and shattered on the marble below. Nobody had been under it. The table directly beneath it had been occupied 30 seconds ago and was now empty. The iron-gray man had stood up to speak, and in standing moved himself and his immediate companions out of the drop zone. Elara stood in the middle of the ballroom floor with her arms still extended from the throw, breathing hard through her nose, and became aware of approximately 60 people staring at her. 60 people, and 6 of them standing, and all of them utterly silent. She lowered her arm. The iron-gray man was looking at her with an expression she could not read. Not surprised. He was past surprise. She somehow knew this without knowing how she knew it. Something else. Something that looked improbably like relief. "I don't know what you think I am," Elara said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that, even though she had no idea where the levelness came from. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly, "you do." And from somewhere beneath the estate, from somewhere deep in the bones of the building she had lived in for 9 years and thought she knew completely, came a sound. Footsteps, many of them, moving fast, and the distinct, unmistakable sound of a safety being released on an automatic weapon. The footsteps were getting louder. Elara heard them the way she heard everything in this building. Through her feet first, the vibration traveling up through marble and into bone before it reached her ears as sound. She had 9 years of Blackthorn Estate in her body, knew its acoustics the way a blind person knows a familiar room, and what she was feeling now was wrong. Too many. Too coordinated. Moving in a pattern that wasn't staff, wasn't catering crew, wasn't any configuration of human movement she associated with legitimate presence in a building like this. The iron-gray man, she still didn't have his name, hadn't been given anyone's name, turned away from her without another word and said something low and fast to the man nearest him, who produced a phone and began moving toward the side exit. The rest of the room had not yet caught up to what was happening. The 60-odd guests were still processing the chandelier, still processing the knife, still processing the 6 standing figures, and the name they'd spoken. That delay, the 2 or 3 seconds it took for a room full of powerful people to shift from confusion to alarm, was the most dangerous interval Elara had ever been in, and she understood that with the same wordless certainty that had guided her hand toward the knife. "Get away from the windows," she said. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. Her voice carried in the silence the same way the iron-gray man's had, without effort, without theater. A few people moved. Most didn't because she was a woman in an ill-fitting gold dress and 9 years of mopping their floors, and the instruction hadn't come with a credential they recognized. Then the east window exploded inward. Not shattered, exploded, the entire pane gone in a single violent displacement of air and glass, a sound like a physical blow to the chest, and with it came the cold night air of the estate grounds, and the immediate, unambiguous understanding that this was not an accident and this was not over. People dropped. Not all of them. Some froze, which was worse, but enough that the room's center of gravity changed instantly, the standing figures hitting the floor or overturning tables with the practiced speed of people who had survived rooms like this before and retained the muscle memory of it. Elara was already at the east wall, pressed flat, 3 feet from the blown window. She could smell it now. The specific chemical bite of shaped explosive, small charge, precision work. Not a grenade. Something designed to breach, not destroy. Whoever was coming through that window, or through whatever other entry point this was meant to distract from, they wanted people alive. Or they wanted a specific person alive and didn't care about the rest. She thought about the name they'd said. Little Angel. She pressed her thumb against her cheekbone and made herself stop. The woman with close-cropped silver hair materialized at Ilara's left. She'd moved fast for someone in formal wear, covering the distance from her table in what felt like 2 seconds, and she was now pressed against the same wall with her back straight and her ice-colored eyes moving across the room in short, systematic sweeps. She held a small firearm that had not been visible during dinner. Elara noted this without surprise, which itself was strange. "Service corridor," Elara said. 30 feet north wall, behind the 3rd floral arrangement. It connects to the kitchen, and from there to the sub-level passage under the east wing. The silver-haired woman looked at her. The look lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. "You know this building," she said. "I clean it." "That's not what I mean." Elara didn't answer. Across the room, 2 of the other central figures, The bald man in white and the heavyset one with the lined face had gotten the majority of their immediate people moving toward the north wall. Not panicked, organized. These were people who had contingency plans for contingency plans, and the plans were activating, and they were activating without her, which meant she should step back and let them work and find somewhere to be small and invisible until this was finished. She didn't move. "The sublevel passage," she said again to the silver-haired woman. "It forks at the old boiler junction. Left fork goes under the gatehouse and comes up in the groundskeeper's outbuilding. Right fork dead ends at a sealed door that hasn't been opened in at least 6 years, but the hinges are on this side." "How do you know a sealed door's hinges are on the inside?" "Because I painted over them when I repainted the sublevel access corridor 3 years ago. The door opens inward. The seal is cosmetic." The silver-haired woman held her gaze for another second. Then she raised 2 fingers towards someone across the room and made a gesture that looked like nothing in particular and clearly meant something specific, because 2 of her people immediately changed direction. The iron-gray man appeared on Alara's right. She hadn't heard him coming. That bothered her in a way she couldn't articulate. "We need to move," he said. "Not to the room, to her." "I'm staff," Alara said. "I'll go with the other staff." "No." His voice was flat, not aggressive, the particular flatness of a man delivering information rather than negotiation. "You won't." "I don't know you." "That's not accurate." "It is from where I'm standing." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite frustration, not quite amusement, an expression that belonged to a longer conversation than they had time for. He let it go. "Then let it be accurate for now," he said, "and move." The service corridor was exactly where Alara had said it was, and it was exactly as narrow and cold and fluorescent lit as it had been every other time she'd walked it, which was somewhere in the range of 3,000 times over 9 years. The smell was familiar. Industrial cleaner, old stone, the faint copper tang that lived in the pipes. Under the fluorescence, the gold dress looked wrong in a way it hadn't under the ballroom chandeliers, cheaper and stranger, and Alara became briefly and absurdly aware that she was still wearing it. 14 people in the corridor, moving fast. The 6 central figures plus their immediate personnel, a total that represented, she was starting to understand, a significant fraction of the most dangerous individuals in this country, all of them currently following a woman who until 40 minutes ago had been distributing program cards. The bald man in white, his suit was less immaculate now, one sleeve torn at the shoulder, fell into step beside her. Up close, he was larger than he'd appeared seated, with hands that were out of proportion with the rest of him, and a face that had been broken and reset more than once. "You threw that knife one-handed," he said. "Yes." "From 15 feet, more or less." "In heels." Alara glanced down at the shoes Mrs. Hargrove had found. 2-inch heel, narrow toe. She hadn't thought about them. She hadn't thought about any of it. The distance, the angle, the force required. Her body had done the calculation and executed it, and she had followed. "The door's at the end," she said, instead of answering. "I'm not asking about the door." "I know." She kept walking. He let it sit for 3 seconds. Then, "Rourke." "What?" "My name, since we're running together in the dark, seemed reasonable." He said it without inflection, the way you'd state a fact about weather. "Alara," she said. "I know," he said. "We've been looking for you for 20 years, Alara." She stopped walking. The people behind her adjusted, the corridor reorganizing around the sudden halt with the fluid efficiency of people trained to adapt to unexpected stops in confined spaces. "I'm a maid," she said. "I've been a maid here since I was 19. Before that, I was in the Whitmore group home in the city. Before that, I was in 2 other placements. And before that..." She stopped. Before that was nothing. Before that was a gap she'd always explained as early childhood amnesia, developmental, normal, something a succession of caseworkers had noted in her file and moved past without investigation. Before that was nothing she could reach. Rourke watched her figure it out. He didn't fill the silence. Whatever he was, he understood the value of letting a person arrive somewhere on their own. "There was no record before Whitmore," she said. "No," he agreed. "There wasn't. Someone put me there." "Someone put you there." He said it carefully. the way you'd confirm a diagnosis. And someone made sure there was nothing to find before it. From somewhere above them, through the stone and the old pipes and the 3 floors of Blackthorn Estate between the corridor ceiling and the night sky, came a sound that resolved itself, after a half-second delay, as automatic weapons fire. Multiple sources. Not random. Coordinated. The iron-gray man who was 6 feet ahead of them turned back. His name, Ilara would learn later, was Cassian Vey, and he ran a criminal organization that operated across 4 countries and had survived 3 government attempts at eradication. But right now he looked at her with an expression that was almost tired. "We can have this conversation when we're not being shot at," he said. "I have questions," Ilara said. "I have answers. Later." Now! His jaw tightened. The corridor was not a place designed for this kind of standoff. Too narrow, too bright, the sounds from above too immediate. But he stopped. Around them, his people held, spreading out to cover the corridor entry points with the automatic positioning of people who'd trained for exactly this. "Who are you?" she said. "All of you. What is this gathering, and what do you want with me?" Vey looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Have you heard of the Greymantle Massacre?" She hadn't. 20 years ago, he said. A coordinated attack on a monastery complex upstate that was being used as a neutral location, a place where the families met, where they brought their children sometimes because it was supposed to be protected. Off limits. His voice didn't change, but something behind it did. 112 people on the grounds that night. Staff, guards, family, 17 children. The weapons fire above had stopped. That was Ilara had learned in the last 15 minutes, not necessarily good news. Silence could mean many things. 14 of the 17 children made it out, Vey continued. The other 3, he paused, not for effect, for something else. The response teams found evidence that someone had been moving through the building before the attack was over, using routes that weren't on any official floor plan, getting people out through passages that weren't supposed to exist. He looked at her. A small figure, moving fast. Someone described seeing a child. "I was 8, Ilara said, without knowing how she knew. The corridor went very quiet. Vey held perfectly still. "What did you just say?" The silver-haired woman, Marin, Ilara would learn, said from behind her. Ilara pressed 2 fingers against her sternum. There was something there, not a memory exactly, more like the shape where a memory had been. A hollow with precise edges, a space that had been carefully emptied. "I don't know why I said that." "But you said it," Rourke said. "I said it." Vey exhaled through his nose. "Someone extracted you from the massacre site and placed you in the system with no prior history and took everything you knew with them. Everything except—" He looked at her hands, at the way she was standing, at the way her eyes had been moving through this corridor since she'd entered it, cataloging the junctions and the shadows and the fastest paths. "Except the part that isn't memory, the part that lives in the body." "I don't know how to fight," Ilara said. "You don't know that you know," Rourke said. "That's different." Somewhere behind them, at the corridor entrance nearest the ballroom, one of Vey's guards held up a closed fist, signal for contact, someone at the door. The guard pressed against the wall beside the door. Through the door from the direction of the ballroom came a different sound now. Purposeful movement, multiple sets of feet, the particular rhythm of a search pattern. Whoever had come through the windows wasn't random. They were clearing the building room by room, and they were moving this way. Ilara looked at the corridor ahead. The sublevel access was 2 junctions away, and from there the options she'd outlined were still viable if the external entry points hadn't been compromised, which she didn't know yet, which meant she was working with incomplete information in a building she'd lived in for 9 years and thought she understood. She thought about the sealed door, the hinges on the inside. She'd painted over them without knowing why she'd looked for them, without knowing why a sealed door's hinge placement had registered as worth noting. Something Vey had said was turning in her mind. Routes that weren't on any official floor plan, passages that weren't supposed to exist. "The sublevel fork," she said. "The sealed door," Rourke said at the same time. She looked at him. "The right fork," he said. "You said it dead ends." "It does." But you know where the hinges are. I painted over them. Why? She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was that she didn't know. She'd been repainting the sub-level corridor as part of a routine maintenance cycle, and she'd looked at the sealed door and looked at the hinge placement and noted it the way she noted things, the way she'd always noted things. Entrances, exits, which way a door swung, which side held the hardware. She had always noted these things. She had always thought it was a quirk. "Come on," she said, and started moving. But the sub-level was colder than the corridor above it, and darker. The lighting down here was functional rather than decorative. Single bare fixtures at intervals, and 2 of them had burned out and not yet been replaced because the maintenance request was on Alara's list for next Tuesday. She knew this without thinking about it. She knew the burned-out fixtures the same way she knew the boiler junction's particular smell and the sound the pipes made in winter when the heating system cycled. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that had been working on a problem she hadn't consciously acknowledged, those pieces of knowledge were assembling themselves into a shape she wasn't ready to look at directly. 14 people moving quietly through the dark. Vay's hand on Alara's shoulder, not gripping, just present, the hand of someone making sure they didn't lose her in the dim. She found the junction without needing the light. Left fork. The groundskeeper's outbuilding, possible freedom or possible kill zone depending on what was waiting on the other side. Right fork. The sealed door she had painted 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon with a roller brush and a can of institutional gray. The right fork? Vay said quietly, a question and not a question. "I don't know what's behind it," Alara said. "But you think it goes somewhere." "I think—" She pressed her hand flat against the stone of the right corridor wall. Cold, old. The particular oldness of foundation stone, the kind laid before the current structure existed. "This wall is older than the house," she said. "Yes," Vay said, "which means this passage is older than the house." "Yes." She looked at him in the dark. "The Blackthorn estate," he said carefully, "was built on the footprint of an earlier structure, one that predated it by about 100 years. Most of the sub-level infrastructure follows the original layout." A pause. "We knew about these passages. The families knew about them. They're part of why this location was chosen for these gatherings, historically." "Historically," Alara repeated. "The passages were meant to be an emergency exit, a last resort." "Like the ones at the Greymantle complex," she said. Silence. "Like those," Vay said. Something cold settled in Alara's chest that wasn't the temperature of the corridor. "Someone taught me," she said, "at Greymantle, before the attack. Someone taught me the hidden routes." "We believe so." "Who?" Vay didn't answer immediately. Behind them, from the direction of the boiler junction, came a sound. The soft, unmistakable scrape of a boot against stone. Someone in the sub-level, someone who hadn't come down with them. Rourke moved first, stepping into the shadow at the junction with his weapon up. 2 of Vay's people spread to either side, covering the angles. Marin pressed against the wall 2 feet from Alara with the particular stillness of someone who had decided what they would do and was simply waiting to do it. "The door," Vay said to Alara, low. "Now." She moved down the right fork, 20 feet, her hand trailing the wall, feeling the stone shift from the rebuilt sub-level construction to the older foundation beneath, and then the door. Painted over, as she'd left it, the institutional gray now dim and slightly luminous in the near dark. She found the hinge side by touch, found the inset pull handle that the paint had half obscured. Behind her, a shot, single, suppressed, barely louder than a hand clap. Then another. Then Rourke's voice. 2 down. There are more. "How many more?" Marin said. Not a question. "Enough," he said. Alara pulled the door. It resisted. 3 years of paint seal and disuse, the frame swollen slightly with moisture. And she pulled again, harder, and it gave with a grinding complaint that sounded enormous in the corridor, and she pulled it fully open, and cold air came out of the dark beyond it, older air, the smell of deep stone and something else underneath. She stood at the threshold. From the dark beyond the door came a smell she knew the same way she'd known her age at the massacre, with no memory attached to the knowing. earth and old wood and the specific mineral coolness of an underground passage that had been sealed and forgotten and was now open again. She had been here before. She did not remember it, but her body had gone very still in the way a body goes still when it recognizes something the mind has been kept from knowing, and Vey was at her shoulder and Marin was behind him, and in the distance back toward the junction, another shot cracked and someone cursed in a language she didn't speak but somehow partially understood. "Inside," Vey said. She stepped through. He came after her, and then the others, and the last person through pulled the door mostly closed behind them, and the dark swallowed everything, and Alara stood in a passage that her mind had never seen, and her hands already knew, and from behind the closed door, getting louder, came the footsteps of people who had been hunting her since before she could remember. And from somewhere deeper in the passage, from somewhere further in the dark ahead, came a sound. Not footsteps. Not mechanical. Something older than either. A low, rhythmic knocking, 3 beats and a pause, 3 beats and a pause, coming from the dark ahead with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. Alara stopped moving. Behind her, Vey stopped. The others compressed into the passage, 14 bodies in a space that accommodated them, but barely. And the darkness was total except for 2 small flashlights that Vey's people had produced and were now angling carefully to avoid throwing light back toward the door they'd come through. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. "What is that?" Marin said very quietly. Alara didn't answer. She was listening to the space between her ears, to the place where the sound was landing, to what it was doing to the muscles in her shoulders and the pace of her breathing. The knocking was doing something specific. It was slowing her down, not frightening her. Something more precise than fear, more like the deliberate deceleration of a system that had been moving too fast and was being brought back to a functional speed. She had heard this before. Not this exact sound. The pattern. "It's a signal," she said. "From who?" Rourke said. "I don't know." She started walking toward it. Vey caught her arm. Not roughly. The grip of someone exercising restraint they weren't entirely sure was warranted. "We don't know what's ahead." "We know what's behind," she said. He let go. Bam. The passage ran straight for 40 feet, and then curved, following a logic that had nothing to do with the estate above it, and everything to do with whatever the original structure had been. The stone here was different from the sublevel they'd come from. Darker, denser, with a texture under Alara's fingertips that felt hand-cut rather than machine-finished. Old work. Patient work. The knocking stopped when they were 10 feet from the curve. Around the curve, a light. Small, battery-powered, the kind of lantern you bought at a hardware store. It sat on the floor of the passage and threw a circle of yellow light against the stone walls. In that circle, sitting on a wooden crate with his hands resting on his knees, was a man. He was old. Not the distinguished old of Vey's iron-gray composure, but genuinely old. The old of a person who had spent decades doing something that cost the body, and the body had kept the invoice. He was thin in the way of people who had always been thin and had recently become thinner. White hair, close-cropped, a face so deeply lined it was almost geological. He wore dark, practical clothing that was dusty at the knees. He looked at Alara when they came around the curve, and his expression did something complicated, a grief and a relief in such close proximity that they were almost indistinguishable. "Lara," he said. Nobody had ever called her that. Her throat closed. "You have the wrong person," she said, and her voice came out wrong, too. Too tight, too controlled, the voice of someone working hard to sound certain. The old man looked at her hands, at the way she was standing, at whatever it was in her bearing that Vey and Rourke had both looked at and recognized something she couldn't see in herself. "No," he said. "I don't." Vey stepped forward. "Harlan." The old man's eyes moved to Vey without warmth. "Cassian, you're supposed to be dead." "Yes," Harlan said. "That was the arrangement." Something shifted in the passage. Not the air, not the temperature, but the quality of the silence between these two men, which was old and complicated and not, Alara was beginning to understand, entirely free of hostility. "Whose arrangement?" Vay said. Harlan looked back at Alara. Sit down, Lara. My name is Alara. That's what I said. Sit down. There was nothing to sit on except the floor, and she was wearing a gold dress, and none of that mattered at all. She sat. His name was Harlan Voss, and he had been for the better part of 30 years the man the six families went to when they needed something done that required more precision than violence and more authority than money. A fixer, at the polite end of the vocabulary. An architect of arrangements, the kind of man who existed in the negative spaces of power structures, invisible and essential and very, very careful. He had also, he told her, been the man who had trained the children. What children? Alara said. The ones who survived what couldn't be survived otherwise. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd describe a professional methodology. The families had enemies who understood that the fastest way to end a dynasty wasn't to kill the patriarch. It was to eliminate the heirs. Every significant criminal organization has the same vulnerability, the next generation. He looked at his hands. I built a program. Small. Quiet. Children from the families and some from outside. Orphans with the right aptitude. We taught them things that children shouldn't need to know and can learn more efficiently than adults. Escape routes, Alara said. Among other things. You trained me. He met her eyes. From the time you were 4 years old. The passage went very quiet. 4, she said. You were exceptional, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was closer to a statement of fact that caused him pain. The route memorization, the spatial reasoning, the instinctive risk calculation. I've trained 31 children over the years. You were different in kind, not just degree. He paused. At Greymantle, when the attack came, the other instructors and I were separated. There was no coordination. The children were scattered across the complex. I was dealing with a fire in the north wing, and I lost contact with everyone. Another pause. Longer. You were 8 years old and you moved 14 children through 3 kilometers of underground passage in the dark in under 40 minutes while an armed team was actively searching above you. You did it using routes you had memorized from a single walkthrough 6 months earlier. Alara said nothing. Something in her chest was doing something she didn't have a name for. Not emotion, or not only emotion, more like the physical sensation of a structure shifting, something that had been load-bearing for a long time beginning to move. After, Harlan continued, when we understood what had happened, how targeted the attack had been, that it wasn't random, that someone with specific knowledge of the families had planned it, the decision was made that whoever had led those children out was in more danger than the children themselves. He looked at her steadily. Because you saw things. You moved through the complex in ways that meant you saw things that night that no one else did. And if the people who ordered the attack understood that, they'd come for me, Alara said. Eventually. Yes. So you hid me. We gave you a new history, and we put you somewhere safe, and we removed everything that could connect you to that night. His voice didn't flinch on it, which was somehow worse than if it had. Including your memories of the training, of me, of Greymantle, of everything before the Whitmore group home. Alara looked at him for a long time. The lantern threw its yellow light across the old stone and across his face and across her hands resting on the skirt of the gold dress, and she was aware of every detail with a clarity that felt almost surgical. You took my memories, she said, a specialist, a procedure that was... He stopped. It wasn't reversible. That was understood. By who? The words came out very flat. By you? By Vay? By the families? She looked at Vay, who was standing 6 feet away with his face doing something careful and controlled. By the people whose children I saved. Nobody answered. I was 8 years old, she said. Someone took my life and put a different one there, and none of you... The flatness in her voice was cracking at the edges, and she felt it happening and couldn't stop it, and found she didn't want to stop it. 20 years. I've been 20 years in that house, cleaning their floors, having no past, Not knowing why I couldn't stop noting the hinge placements on every door I walked through, why I counted exits in every room, why I never felt like I fit inside the life I was living because someone built it for me and built it wrong. Alara, Vey said. Don't. She stood up, the dress dragged. She didn't look at it. Don't say my name like you have the right to it. Vey absorbed this without changing expression. There was something in that, in the steadiness of it, that she found infuriating and also distantly clarifying. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't explaining. He was letting her arrive at wherever she was going to arrive. You knew, she said to him, at the estate, tonight. You came to this gathering knowing I was here. A pause. Brief. Yes, he said. You came here because of me. We received information that you'd been located, that the people who ordered Greymantle had also received that information. He held her gaze. We came to get to you first. And if they had gotten here first? He didn't answer. What would they have done, she said, if they'd found me before you did? They would have killed you, Harlan said from behind her. Simple. Because of what you know. I don't know anything. I don't remember anything. That's not what they believe. Harlan shifted on the crate. And it's not entirely accurate. The procedural memory, the physical training, that remained intact, as we've established. But that wasn't the only thing. He looked at her carefully. In the weeks before Greymantle, there was a document, specific financial records and operational communications that would identify the primary architect of the attack, the person behind the organization that ordered it. That document was hidden inside the complex. We knew it existed. We believed it had been destroyed in the fire. He paused. But you were in the complex after the fire started, and you had a habit, even at 8, of picking things up and carrying them, of not leaving things behind. Alara stared at him. There's something I'm supposed to know, she said slowly. That I don't know I know. We think so. Yes. Something that identifies the man who built the network that ordered Greymantle and has been running that network for 20 years since. Harlan looked at his hands, and who, based on tonight's attack, now knows where you are. From behind them, from the direction of the closed door at the passage entrance, came a sound that arrived like a fist through her focus. Not the measured knocking of Harlan's signal, but a sharp, irregular percussion that resolved after a single terrible second into the sound of the door being forced. They'd found the passage. Rourke was already moving back toward the curve, weapon up. 2 of Vey's other people followed. Marin was at Alara's side with one hand on her arm, not pulling, just present. How far does this passage go? Vey said to Harlan. 200 meters. It opens beneath the east boundary wall near the old groundskeeper cottage. You said near. How near? 20 feet. Is that exit covered? Harlan's face did something. It was, he said. Vey went still. Was. I came in through it 40 minutes ago. It was clear. His voice had changed. Something in it had gone careful in a way that was frightening. I had 2 people covering the external exit while I waited for you. And now? Marin said. Harlan looked at the floor of the passage. I've had no contact with them for the last 20 minutes. The door at the end of the passage gave with a sound like a gunshot. The frame failing, not the lock. And then voices, multiple, moving fast, and behind those voices the specific compressed sound of weapons being readied. They were in the passage now. The exit, Vey said, sharp. Maybe compromised, Harlan said. Maybe. I can't confirm either way. Vey looked at Alara. In the lantern light, his face was all shadow and angles, and something she was beginning to be able to read, the expression of a man calculating probabilities in real time and not finding any of them acceptable. The exit, he said to her. Not a question. She understood what he was asking, not whether to take it. They had no choice. The passage behind them was closing. He was asking whether she could run point on what was waiting on the other side, whether the thing in her body that had thrown a knife across a ballroom and remembered a door's hinge placement across 3 years of painted-over evidence could extend to an exterior engagement in an unknown condition. She didn't know the answer. She was going to find out. "Stay behind me," she said, "until I know what we're walking into." She picked up Harlan's lantern and turned it off. In the dark, she started moving. The passage's dimensions came to her through her feet and her fingertips. Width, ceiling height, the curve and texture of the floor. She moved faster than she should have been able to without light, faster than any of the 14 people behind her could have followed if they hadn't been disciplined enough to move by sound and trust. She could hear them, the controlled breathing, the deliberate footfall, the occasional brush of fabric against stone, and she could hear, behind them all, the people in the passage closing the distance. 200 meters. She ran the math without knowing she was running it. They were going to arrive at the exit with perhaps 90 seconds advantage, 90 seconds to assess, adapt, and neutralize whatever was waiting on the other side. The exit came up faster than she expected. A door identical to the one they'd come through, same hinges, same side, same institutional gray paint that she recognized in her fingertips before she saw it in the dark. She pressed her ear against it. Nothing. The wrong kind of nothing. Not the nothing of an empty space, but the nothing of a space where something was holding very still. She reached back without turning. Someone put a weapon in her hand. She didn't look at what it was. Her fingers found the parts of it they needed to find, and the rest was already decided. She put her hand on the door, took one breath. She opened it. The cold night air hit her like a door itself. She was through and moving before the light had fully registered. A half moon. Enough to see by, the dark shape of the groundskeeper cottage 20 feet ahead, and between her and it, 2 men in dark tactical gear who had heard the door and were already turning. She went left, drawing their motion, and the first man tracked her, which was his mistake, because it took his weapon off the door, and through the door came Rourke, who didn't miss. The second man was faster and smarter, and got his weapon up toward Alara, and she was already below the angle, under his arm, and her body did something her mind did not plan, something efficient and brutal and final. She straightened up, breathing hard. Both men down. She was standing in the cold dark outside the Blackthorn estate she had lived in for 9 years, holding a weapon that wasn't hers, wearing a gold dress that didn't fit, with 14 people coming through the door behind her and an unknown number more coming through the passage. And somewhere in the structure of her own mind was information that people had already killed for tonight and would kill for again. Vey emerged from the door and took in the scene in 2 seconds. He looked at her. "We need a vehicle," she said. Her voice was steady. She noted that with a kind of distant surprise. "East of the cottage," Harlan said, emerging last, slightly hunched against the cold. "A van. Keys are in it." "You planned an extraction," Marin said. "I planned several things," Harlan said. "Not all of them worked." Alara was looking at the cottage, at the shadows around it, at the specific quality of the darkness near the northeast corner that was slightly denser than it should have been. "There's someone at the cottage," she said quietly. Everyone stopped. "Northeast corner," she said. "Not moving. Could be one of your people." She looked at Harlan. "Or not." Harlan looked at the northeast corner. Then he looked at the ground, and something crossed his face that was quick and controlled, but not quick enough. Alara saw it. "Harlan," she said. "It's probably Harlan." Her voice had gone very flat. The same flat it had gone in the corridor when she'd told Vey not to say her name. "Look at me." He looked at her. "What did you plan?" she said. "Specifically, what did you actually plan tonight?" He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he said, "There are things about tonight that I couldn't tell the families. Things about why this had to happen here, now, this way." "What things?" Vey said. His voice had changed too. Something cold had entered it. "The document," Harlan said. "The one from Greymantle. I told you we believed it was destroyed. That wasn't entirely accurate." Silence. "I recovered it," he said. "Years ago. I've had it." He looked at Alara. "The problem isn't that we don't know who ordered Greymantle. The problem is that the evidence is incomplete. The document identifies a network but not the head of it. Not specifically." He paused. "But there's a second piece. A piece that I believe was encoded. Not written, not documented, but given to someone to carry. Someone young enough that it would stay safe where no surveillance could find it. Someone whose memory had been—" "Don't," Alara said. Someone who was carrying it without knowing they were carrying it, Harlan said. Hidden inside the same procedure that removed the surface memories. Buried deeper. Intact. The density near the northeast corner of the cottage moved, not an ally. A man in dark gear stepped out of the shadow with his weapon already up, and he wasn't looking at Vay or Rourke or Marin, he was looking at Alara. She doesn't leave, the man said. His accent was flat, mid-Atlantic, professional. He was not alone. Alara could see now, in the moonlight, 3 more emerging from the tree line to the east. The woman stays. Everyone else. He didn't finish the sentence because Rourke shot him. The 3 from the tree line opened up, and the night exploded into noise, and everyone was moving, Marin pulling Alara left, Vay's people returning fire. The van somewhere in the dark passed the cottage, and between them and it 4 armed professionals who had been waiting in exactly the right place. Exactly the right place. Alara hit the ground behind a low stone wall, Marin beside her, and in the span of 3 seconds between incoming rounds, she looked back at Harlan, who was crouched behind the doorframe of the passage exit. He wasn't shooting. He wasn't helping. He was watching the firefight with the expression of a man who had planned for most of this. He told them, Marin said, very quietly. Not a question. Not all of them, Alara said. He wanted to control the extraction. He wanted to be the one who brings me in, to whoever's running the network, as a bargaining chip. The certainty arrived without a memory attached to it, just the cold computational clarity she was learning to stop questioning. He doesn't know the head of the network either. He's been working for them for 20 years without knowing who they are. And he thinks I'm the... She finished the sentence in the same breath she used to move. Not toward the van, not toward the tree line, toward Harlan. She covered the 12 feet between herself and the passage door in the time it took the firefight to produce its next exchange of shots, moving low and fast along the wall with the weapon up and the cold air burning in her lungs, and she came around the doorframe and put the barrel against Harlan's chest before he had finished processing that she was coming. He went very still. The procedure, she said. Her breathing was hard, but her hands weren't. She noted that with the same distant precision she noted everything now. The one that removed my memories. Who did it? Alara. Who? He looked at the weapon, then at her face. Whatever he found in her face made him decide quickly. A man named Solon, he said. Declan Solon. He was a specialist. Neurological conditioning, primarily for intelligence applications. He worked for... Harlan stopped. Say it. He worked for the same network that ordered Greymantle, before I knew that. Before I understood what I'd brought him into. Behind her, the firefight was still running. Controlled exchanges now, both sides finding cover, the initial chaos compressing into something more professional and more dangerous. She heard Rourke's voice, sharp, giving coordinates. She heard return fire from the tree line, closer than before. She had maybe 90 seconds before the tactical situation shifted into something that made this conversation impossible. Solon is still alive, she said. It wasn't a question. Harlan's face told her. Where? Alara, what you're thinking? I'm thinking that if the encoded information is inside my own head and Solon put it there, then Solon can get it out. I'm thinking that's why you brought me here tonight, specifically, not for the families, not for protection, but because you need Solon to have access to me in a controlled environment so you can deliver him what he needs and collect what you've been promised. She held his gaze. How close am I? His silence was precise and complete. Harlan. She pushed the barrel against his sternum. 1 inch. Enough. How close? He's at a facility, Harlan said quietly. 40 minutes from here. That was the plan. Get you out through the passage, through the east exit, into the van. Solon's people would have been waiting at a secondary location. I would have... He stopped again. Traded me, she said. Negotiated, he said with a kind of dignity that turned her stomach. There are things he has that I need. Records. The identities of people embedded in 3 of the 6 families. If I don't get those records, people die. People inside those families who don't know they're already targeted. So you were going to hand me to the man who already took my mind apart once. He didn't answer. She pulled the weapon back. "Tell me where the facility is," she said. "If I tell you, you're going to tell me," she said. "The question is whether you tell me now or whether I leave you here and you explain to the men in the tree line that you couldn't complete the delivery." She watched his face. "I don't think they'll be forgiving." Harlan Voss, who had spent 30 years building and protecting and carefully calculating the survivable path through impossible situations, looked at the woman he'd made and unmade, and looked at what she'd become in the years he'd left her sealed inside a borrowed life, and told her. She turned back to the firefight. Marin saw her coming and didn't ask questions, which was the right instinct. "Van," Ilara said. "Past the cottage, east side, covered from 2 angles. Give me 30 seconds. "For what?" "To clear one of the angles." Marin looked at her with those ice-colored eyes, and whatever she saw was apparently sufficient because she said, 20 seconds, and turned to signal Rourke. Ilara went north along the passage wall, away from the firefight, into the dark where the property's old tree line ran close to the building. The moon was still up, enough light to see, not enough to be seen clearly, and she was moving in a way she hadn't known she could move until tonight. Low to the ground, weight forward, each footfall placed rather than landed, the weapon up but not leading. The angle was coming from a man positioned behind a low stone outcropping at the northeast edge of the property, from which position he had clean sight lines to both the cottage's east face and the most direct path to the van. She'd clocked him during the first exchange. He'd fired twice and repositioned once, which told her discipline and training but not exceptional initiative. He was holding his assigned position. That made him predictable. She came at him from behind the tree line, from an angle that required her to cover 30 feet of open ground for the last stretch, and she ran it. He heard her at 15 feet and started to turn, and she was already inside the turn, already past the barrel, and what happened next was brief and without dignity. And when it was done, she was breathing in sharp pulls through her nose, with her knees on frozen ground and her hands not entirely steady for the first time tonight. She stood up. "Now," she said, not loudly. The van was a dark panel vehicle, engine already running. Harlan had told the truth about the keys. Rourke drove, because Rourke had gotten there first, and nobody argued with how Rourke moved when he moved with purpose. Marin took the passenger seat. Vey and Ilara and 2 others in the back, the doors pulling shut as they were still moving, the estate's east gate coming up fast and unmanned because whoever had planned tonight's external containment had not, apparently, planned for all 6 families' security personnel working in the same direction at the same time. They went through the gate. Behind them, Blackthorn Estate receded in the rear window. Lit up now, external lights triggered, the distant figures of people who had come for something they hadn't gotten yet and would have to account for. Ilara sat on the van's metal floor with her back against the wall and looked at Vey across the dark interior. "Solon," she said. "I heard," he said. "You were close enough to hear?" "I was 6 feet away the entire time you spoke with Harlan. I'm surprised you didn't notice." She had noticed. She'd filed it and kept moving. "Then you know where the facility is." "I know." "And?" His hands rested on his knees. Outside the van, the road was dark and flat, the city aglow on the horizon. "And 40 minutes ago, I would have told you that walking into a facility run by a network we don't have complete intelligence on, with a team that just took casualties in a tactical position that's exposed, would be inadvisable." 40 minutes ago, she said, before I knew what Harlan was. He paused. "The embedded agents he mentioned, the people inside the families who are already targeted. If that's true..." "It's true," Ilara said. "You can't know that. I know Harlan." She said it without thinking and then sat with the strangeness of it, knowing a man she had no memory of, whose voice had done something specific to her breathing from the moment she heard it in the dark. "I've known him my whole life. I just didn't know I knew him." She pressed her back harder against the van wall. "He's not lying about the records. He was lying about his methods, not his intelligence." Vey studied her. "What do you think is inside your own head?" he said, carefully. "I think someone gave me a name," she said. "The head of the network. The architect? I think I was given it because I was 8 years old and nobody searches an 8-year-old's memory for operational intelligence. and I was going into a procedure that would surface seal everything anyway. She looked at her hands. I think whoever gave it to me knew there was a chance the procedure could be reversed under the right conditions. A fail-safe. And the right conditions, Marin said from the front seat, not turning, would be finding Solon. Or someone with his specific knowledge. Alara paused. But Solon is what we have. The van was quiet for a moment, except for road noise. Rourke said from the driver's seat, "You understand what it means to walk into that facility." "Tell me anyway." "It means Solon's people will be expecting a delivery, a compliant subject for a neurological procedure. What they won't be expecting is 6 families worth of backing and a woman who spent tonight being shot at." He glanced in the mirror. "Element of surprise, that's the entire asset." "How long does it last?" she said. "Until someone from the estate makes contact. Could be 20 minutes, could be less." Alara looked at Vey. "You said you came to the gathering to get to me first," she said. "You have me. What were you planning to do with me?" "Keep you safe," he said. "That's not a plan." "No," he admitted. "We hadn't gotten further than extraction. The intelligence about your location came through quickly. We didn't have time to Then this is the plan," she said. "Solon's facility. We go in, we get whatever's inside my head out where everyone can see it, and we end this tonight." "We don't have enough people," Marin said. "We have enough." "You don't know that." "No," Alara said. "But I know the alternative is spending the rest of my life being hunted by a network I can't identify, by a man whose name I'm apparently carrying around without access to it, while the embedded agents inside your families work toward whatever the network has planned for them." She looked around the van's dark interior, at Vey, at Marin's profile in the front seat, at Rourke's hands on the wheel, at the 2 others who had not spoken, but whose faces in the van's dim light were the faces of people who had already made calculations and arrived somewhere decisive. "Tell me I'm wrong." Nobody told her she was wrong. The facility was a converted industrial building on the city's eastern fringe, the kind of neighborhood that had been 3 different things in 30 years and was currently in between reinventions: empty lots, a few functioning small businesses that minded themselves, the scattered infrastructure of an area that had given up on being watched. The building itself was 4 stories of weathered concrete with blacked-out windows and a loading dock that had been retrofitted with a security door that cost more than the building's assessed value. Rourke drove past it once without slowing. "Cameras," he said. "Loading dock. 2 at the front entrance, at least 1 on the east corner. Interior I can't assess from here." "Guards?" Marin said. 2 visible at the front, more inside. The camera coverage suggests they're confident in the perimeter, which means the interior force is probably heavier than the exterior." Alara was looking at the building as they passed, looking at it the way she'd learned tonight to look at things, not searching for what was visible, but cataloging what the visible implied about what wasn't. The loading dock security door was newer than the rest of the building, installed after the original construction, which meant it had been installed for a specific purpose. The retrofit suggested the loading bay was a primary entry point for materials that needed controlled access, or people. The windows on the second floor were blacked out differently from the ones above. Heavier treatment, the kind used for soundproofing as well as light elimination. "Second floor," she said. "What about it?" Vey said. "That's where Solon works." She wasn't certain. She said it anyway because the certainty was in her body, and she'd stopped requiring it to pass through her conscious mind for validation. "The loading dock brings in equipment through the ground floor. The procedure rooms are on 2. "There's no external access to the second floor," Rourke said. "There's a fire escape on the north face," Marin said. "It was behind the angle as we passed, but I caught it." "Camera coverage on the north face?" Vey said. "Couldn't see." "Then that's the assumption we operate on," Alara said. "Camera on the north face. We go in the front." Silence. "The front," Rourke said. "They're expecting a delivery," Alara said. "Harlan's van, a compliant subject." She looked around the van. "Give them that." For about 30 seconds. Another silence, different in quality from the first. "You want to walk in," Vey said. "I want to be walked in." "There's a difference." She met his eyes. "They take me through the front. They take me to the second floor, and you have the exterior. The cameras go down because Rourke does something about the cameras. The guards at the front are occupied with the delivery. North face fire escape is your entry point. If the cameras don't go down in time, then it gets harder, she said. But we're already past the easy version of tonight, so... Rourke exhaled. It wasn't quite a laugh. The cameras, Vey said to him. 60 seconds if the junction box is where I think it is, Rourke said. Maybe 45. Can you guarantee 45? I can guarantee I'll be fast. Vey looked at Alara. The van had stopped 2 blocks from the facility, engine idling, and in the quiet she could hear her own pulse. Not racing, which surprised her, just present, solid, regular in the way of something that had decided. Once you're inside, he said, we won't know your position. No. You'll be alone in there until we breach. I've been alone in there since I was 8 years old, she said. I just didn't know it. Vey held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached inside his jacket and produced a small device. A radio earpiece, compact, the kind designed not to be visible. 90 seconds after you go in, he said. That's how long before we move. She took the earpiece. If something happens in the first 90 seconds, she said, then we adjust. I need more than that. He held her gaze. If you go down in the first 90 seconds, we come in anyway. We don't leave you there. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had taken something from her without asking, 20 years ago, and who was looking at her now with an expression she was only beginning to have the vocabulary for, not guilt exactly, too old and too settled for guilt, more like the look of someone who had been carrying a debt they'd accepted as unpayable and had not yet processed the possibility of a different arrangement. She put the earpiece in. 90 seconds, she said, and opened the van door. The cold hit her again. She was getting used to the cold. She walked toward the front entrance of the facility with her hands visible and the weapon she'd taken from Harlan's would-be buyer inside the waistband of the gold dress, invisible under the structured bodice that didn't quite fit. She walked the way she'd walked into the ballroom 2 hours ago. Not like a maid, not like a weapon, just like a person walking somewhere with a specific destination. The 2 guards at the front clocked her at 30 feet. She could see them process her. The dress, the dark hair coming loose from where Mrs. Hargrove had pinned it, the improbability of the image. One of them already had his radio up. She stopped 10 feet from them. Harlan Voss sent me, she said. He said you'd be expecting a delivery. The guard with the radio spoke into it. 20 seconds. He listened. Where's Voss? He said. He had a complication at the estate, she said. He sent me ahead. You're the... He looked at the dress, at her face. You're the subject. Yes, she said. He looked at his colleague. Some decision was made between them that involved no visible communication and resulted in the first guard saying into his radio again something Alara couldn't hear. Then he stepped aside and gestured her toward the door. She walked through. The ground floor was precisely what she'd expected, industrial, repurposed. The concrete floors clean in a way that suggested recent and deliberate cleaning rather than natural tidiness. 3 men visible, positioned at intervals that indicated coverage rather than grouping. A freight elevator at the far end, steel doors. One of the guards from outside followed her in. His hand came to her elbow, not roughly, the practiced grip of someone who had escorted compliant subjects before. Elevator, he said. She walked to the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped in. The guard stepped in with her. He reached past her to press the button for the second floor. In her earpiece, nothing yet. Rourke working. She counted. The elevator began to rise. She had perhaps 15 seconds before the doors opened on the second floor, and whatever was waiting there became the immediate problem. In her earpiece, at 11 seconds, Rourke's voice. Cameras down. She exhaled. The elevator stopped. The doors opened on a corridor that was cleaner than the floor below. Better lit, the particular antiseptic precision of a space where careful work happened. At the end of the corridor, a door. On either side of the corridor, 2 more guards. And standing in the middle of the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, with the patient expression of a man who had been waiting for a specific delivery and was satisfied that it had arrived, was a man she had never seen before and recognized instantly. recognized the way she recognized Harlan's voice, from somewhere below memory, from the part of her that had been 8 years old in a burning building and had looked into this face while it explained very calmly that she wouldn't remember any of this. Declan Solon was shorter than she'd have expected. Late 60s, tidy, with the careful grooming of a man who maintained control through precision. He wore a white coat over a dark shirt, and he looked at her with an expression that was professional and entirely cold. "Well," he said, "here we are." "Here we are," she said. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You've had an eventful evening." "You could say that." The memories are returning. It wasn't a question. He was reading something in her face, or in her posture, with the clinical attention of someone who knew exactly what the returning memories looked like from the outside. Partially, motor function and spatial memory first, which is consistent with the procedural layering we used. He took a step toward her. "What do you remember specifically?" "Enough," she said. "The name?" he said. "Do you remember the name?" And there it was, the thing that had brought him to this corridor, that had driven 20 years of a network's attention, that had sent armed men through a ballroom window and through a passage door and into the trees outside an estate where a woman in a gold dress had spent 9 years learning nothing about herself. He wanted the name. She looked at him. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place that had been carefully sealed and was now carefully opening, something was coming loose. Not violently. Not the way the chandelier had come loose, or the way the passage door had given. Nothing structural, nothing that broke. More like the way a knot comes undone when the right thread is pulled. A slow, sequential release of tension that had been in place so long the tension itself had been mistaken for the natural state of things. She looked at Declan Solon, and the knot came undone. The name arrived the way the knife throw had arrived, the way the door's hinge placement had arrived. Not from thought, not from retrieval, but from the body. From the part of her that had been 8 years old and had listened to a man's voice explain, with professional patience, that she wouldn't remember any of this. She had not remembered, but she had carried it. "Whitfield," she said. Solon went very still. "Commander Aldous Whitfield," she said. "Defense Intelligence. Retired. Now operating under 3 corporate shells. Heron Capital, Solace Infrastructure, and a foundation called the Grey Ridge Institute." She felt each piece arrive as she spoke it, like coordinates resolving on a map she'd been reading blind. He built the network using intelligence contacts over a 30-year career. He ordered Greymantle because 3 of the 6 families had evidence of his early operations. Blackmail material he couldn't buy back and couldn't negotiate away. He needed the families destroyed. He needed their records destroyed. And he needed the one person who'd seen his courier see, the man who delivered the operational order to the monastery 2 days before the attack. She stopped. Let it settle. He needed that person to disappear. The courier. A man she had seen at age 8 through a gap in a door she wasn't supposed to be behind, listening to a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear, and had seen again at the estate 3 years later when he'd come with a man in a white coat and she'd been put to sleep. She looked at Solon. "I saw his face," she said. "The courier. I could describe him. I could have described him at 8. Someone understood that." She kept her voice level. Her hands were steady. Everything in her was very steady. "You took my memory to protect Whitfield's man. And when Whitfield learned tonight that I'd been found, that the families had found me first, he sent a team to finish what Greymantle started." Solon's professional composure was still in place, but something behind it had shifted. The calculation of a man reassessing a situation that had moved outside his prepared parameters. "That's," he said carefully, "a significant set of claims." "Yes," she said, "it is. You have no documentation." "Harlan does," she said. "The records he recovered from Greymantle. They name the network. They name the shells. They don't name Whitfield directly. You made sure of that. But with the courier's identity and Harlan's documentation and everything I just said on record," she held his gaze. "It's sufficient." "On record," Solon said. Slowly. "I've been transmitting since I stepped into the elevator," she said. The earpiece. She watched him look at it. Everything I said in this corridor? Names, shells, the courier? 6 families receiving it live. She paused. And one very uncomfortable former intelligence commander who I imagine is listening right now through whatever monitoring system he has on your facility. The corridor was completely silent. Then, from the room at the end of the corridor behind Solon, came a sound. A single sharp impact, something heavy against a desk or a wall, the sound of a man registering information he hadn't prepared for. Solon turned toward the sound. That was his mistake. She moved. Not toward Solon. He wasn't the problem right now. The guards were the problem, and the guard who'd ridden up in the elevator with her had been standing 3 feet behind her left shoulder for this entire conversation with the particular readiness of someone who hadn't been told to do anything yet but was waiting to be told. She went left before he could process the movement, inside his reach, and what she did was fast and specific and left him on the corridor floor without his weapon. The 2 corridor guards reacted. She went low, beneath the first angle, and the weapon she'd taken from the elevator guard came up, and she put 2 rounds into the wall, 6 inches from the first corridor guard's head. Not to hit, to redirect, to buy the half-second she needed. And through the earpiece, Vei's voice said, "We're in." And from the stairwell at the far end of the corridor came the sound of a door hitting the wall, and Rourke coming through it at a speed that made the corridor suddenly very crowded. 15 seconds. The second corridor guard had her in his sights, and Rourke took him off it, and the first was still processing the rounds in the wall beside his head, and by the time he'd finished processing, Marin was through the stairwell door behind Rourke, and the situation in the corridor had resolved itself into something that favored people who'd had worse nights than this and were still moving. Solon had not run. He was standing in the middle of the corridor with his hands at his sides, and he was looking at Alara with an expression she recognized, not fear, not quite, the look of a man who had survived a long time by understanding which situations were recoverable and which were not, and was currently making that assessment. "It's done," she said to him. Not unkindly. "The name is out. Everyone has it now. Whatever Whitfield promised you for delivering me, it's not on the table anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down on the floor of the corridor. Not dramatically. He simply bent his knees and lowered himself, the way a very tired man sits when there's no longer a reason to stand. She left him there. The room at the end of the corridor was an office, not a procedure room. Whatever Solon had been planning to do with her tonight hadn't been set up yet, which meant the 40-minute drive had been a margin she hadn't known she had. The office contained monitors, a secure communications array, and a man she'd never seen in person sitting behind a desk with a phone in his hand and the look of someone who has just heard something through that phone that has ended a significant portion of their life. Aldous Whitfield was in his 70s, broad across the shoulders, with the remnant posture of a man who had spent decades in institutions that valued it. His hair was white, and his suit was expensive, and his face was doing something she recognized from Harlan's face earlier in the night. The specific geography of a man encountering the consequences of a calculation that hadn't accounted for everything. He looked up when she came through the door, looked past her at Rourke and Marin, looked at the phone in his hand as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. He put it down. "You're Ashcroft," he said. "Yes." "You were 8 years old," he said. It came out with a strange quality, not an excuse, not quite, more like a man genuinely wrestling with a fact he'd known in the abstract and was only now encountering in its concrete form. "Yes," she said again. "I didn't—" He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he appeared to think better of it. He was a man who had spent 30 years in intelligence, which meant he understood the difference between what was true and what was useful to say, and he was experienced enough to know when neither category applied. Vei came through the door behind Alara. Whitfield looked at him. Something old and cold passed between them, the recognition of men who have been on opposite sides of the same equation for a long time. "Cassian," Whitfield said. "Aldous," Vei said. Silence. "The courier," Vei said. "His name." "You don't need it now," Whitfield said. "She's already broadcast everything. The name, the shells. It's over. The courier is still active. 3 of those families still have people he could reach. His name." Whitfield looked at Alara. She held his gaze without expression. He gave the name. Rourke wrote it down on the back of his hand with a pen he produced from somewhere, which was such a specific and ordinary gesture in the middle of this that Alara felt something release in her chest, a pressure she hadn't fully registered until it wasn't there. "The documentation," Vey said to Whitfield. "The operational records from Greymantle that you kept. Every order, every shell, every embedded agent. You won't get those from me." "We'll get them from Harlan," Alara said. "He has copies. He's been using them as insurance." She watched Whitfield absorb this. "He told me tonight. He's been holding them because he wanted leverage over the network. He didn't know who was running the network, but he knew the records were worth something." She paused. "He'll trade them now. He doesn't have anything else left to trade." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. "You were exceptional," he said. The same word Harlan had used, with the same quality: factual, costly. "Even at 8, we understood that when we debriefed the children afterward." He looked at his hands on the desk. That was the problem. The others forgot what they'd seen. The details blurred. Children's memory, he made a gesture. Unreliable. But yours. The debriefers said you described the courier in enough detail to produce a composite that would have been actionable. At 8 years old, from a single glimpse through a door. He shook his head slightly. "We couldn't risk it." "So you took everything," she said. "We took the relevant parts." "You took all of it," she said. Her voice stayed level. It cost her something she couldn't quantify to keep it level. "You took my history, my name, the people who trained me. 20 years I spent in a house cleaning floors and not knowing why the windows felt like exits and why I couldn't sleep with my back to a door. You took all of it." He didn't answer. There wasn't an answer he could give that would land differently than silence. Marin's voice from the corridor. "We need to move. Whoever Whitfield called after the broadcast, we don't know what's coming." Vey looked at Whitfield. "Stand up," he said. Whitfield stood up. It took 11 days. Later, that was the thing Alara found strangest. That something which had been building for 20 years resolved itself in 11 days. The documentation from Harlan, who did trade it, who had in fact produced it within hours of the facility, as though he'd had it packaged in anticipation of exactly this negotiation. The financial records that cross-referenced with Whitfield's shells and produced, under the attention of 3 separate governments and 2 international bodies, that the 6 families quietly steered toward the correct documents, a case that was not clean and was not simple but was sufficient. The courier's name that Rourke had written on the back of his hand, his name was Pavel Rennick, and he was found in a city 300 miles away. And what happened after he was found was not something that went through any official channel and was not something Alara asked about in detail. Whitfield was arrested on the 11th day. The arrest was made through official channels because by that point the documentation was sufficient for official channels to act, and the 6 families had made it quietly and clearly known that official action was the expected response. The alternative response was not one anyone wanted to see demonstrated. Harlan Voss was not arrested. This was a decision that the 6 families made together in a meeting Alara was not present for and informed her of afterward. The reasoning, as Vey explained it, was that Harlan's knowledge of the network's embedded agents was not fully contained in the documents he'd provided. There were things he knew that he hadn't written down. The way people with 30 years of operational intelligence always know things they haven't written down. And those things were more useful in his continued, monitored, significantly constrained existence than in his absence. Alara did not agree with this decision. She said so, once, to Vey, in a direct and unambiguous way that she suspected very few people in his life had used with him, and he listened without interruption, and when she was finished he said that he understood and that she was not wrong, and that it was nonetheless the decision that had been made. She didn't ask again. She filed it in the category of things she was learning existed in the world, correct positions held by people who don't have the power to enforce them, compromises made in the gap between what should happen and what is survivable. She was learning there were a lot of things in that category. On the 14th day after the night at Blackthorn Estate, Alara went back. Not to clean. The estate had been closed since the attack. Police investigation, then remediation, then the particular administrative limbo of a property that had witnessed something that powerful people were quietly determining how to characterize officially. The staff had been given paid leave, which was the kind of gesture that meant no one knew yet whether the estate would reopen. She went in through the service entrance, which she still had a key to, and walked the halls alone. It was different, empty. Quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful, more like the quiet of a space that had been holding its breath and was still holding it. The ballroom was partially cleaned, but not fully. Someone had removed the shattered chandelier pendant, but the cable was still cut above, the secondary support still holding the body of the fixture at its abbreviated height. There was a dark stain on the marble near the east wall where someone had bled. She stood in the center of the ballroom for a while. 9 years. She'd spent 9 years in this building and known it as well as any person could know a building, and it had contained in its sub-level foundation the passage that led back to everything she'd been before she was placed here. She didn't know how to feel about that. She'd tried to decide and found that her feelings on it were not simple enough to be decided. They were multiple and contradictory, and would probably remain so, which was something she was also learning to accommodate. She went to the service corridor, the narrow fluorescent lit passage where Mrs. Hargrove had handed her a gold dress and told her to be invisible. She stood there for a while too, then she left. The meeting with all 6 families together happened 3 weeks later, in a location that was not Blackthorn Estate, a more discreet property, smaller, the kind of venue that didn't advertise its own existence. Alara came alone, which she could see made the security personnel on all 6 sides uncomfortable, which she found she didn't particularly care about. They were all there. Vey, with his iron-gray authority and his careful eyes. Rourke, who nodded at her when she came in with the particular nod of someone who has been in a bad corridor with a person and considers that a form of introduction that holds. Marin, who had returned Alara's weapon to her 3 days after the facility in a plain envelope with no note, which was the most Marin-shaped gesture Alara could have imagined. The heavy-set man with the lined face, whose name was Drago, who said almost nothing but had a way of occupying a room that made you aware of his presence at every point. A woman named Cass, who ran a network that operated in ports, and who had been the most skeptical of Alara's identity on the night of the gathering, and was now looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite apology, but was in the neighborhood. The youngest of the 6, the coiled one, whose name was Taryn, who was watching her with unconcealed assessment and made no effort to hide it, which she respected more than the careful politeness of the others. They made her offers. Vey went first, which meant the others had agreed he should go first, which meant they'd had a conversation before she arrived, which she filed without reaction. Resources, security, a position, formally undefined, that would give her access to the combined intelligence operations of all 6 families and a seat at whatever table decisions like the Harlan decision were made at. A chance, he said, to make sure that particular kind of decision went differently in the future. She listened to all of it. Then she said, Blackthorn Estate. A pause. What about it? Vey said. The property. I want it. She looked around the table. Not ownership, operational control, long-term lease, effectively permanent, with capital funding from the 6 families jointly. She watched their faces. It has 46 acres, a main house with 32 rooms, a sub-level with more space than anyone has ever properly used, and grounds that have been professionally maintained for decades. She kept her voice even. I want to run a residential program for children displaced by violence, the kind of children who get placed in group homes with no prior history and no one looking for what they came from. Silence. I know what that costs, she said. I know what I'm asking. I'm also aware that each of you has, at various points in your careers, made decisions that created children like that. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think you know it's true, and I think knowing it is relevant to whether you do this. Nobody argued with the statement. It won't fix anything, Drago said. He had a deep, slow voice that he used rarely. What you're describing? No, she said. You understand that. I understand that it will help specific children in a specific program have a better outcome than the alternative. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. He nodded, once, slowly. Vey looked around the table. Something moved between all of them. Not a vote, not a discussion, something more like the collective settling of people who have arrived at a position. The estate, he said, and capital funding. And if you change your mind about the other offer, I won't, she said. But if you do. She looked at him, at the careful steadiness of him, at the man who had come to that ballroom to find her, and had found instead something he hadn't fully planned for, and was trying, in the way of people who are accustomed to controlling outcomes, to leave a door open against the contingency of a future he couldn't predict. Then I'll tell you, she said. Spring came late that year. Alara noticed it in the grounds first, the particular smell of the Blackthorn Estate's soil when it began to soften, a smell she recognized from 9 years of working the external maintenance crew in warmer months, something between iron and green. She was standing at the main house's east-facing window, the one that looked out over the long slope of lawn toward the old groundskeeper's cottage, when she noticed it. Behind her, the main house was in organized chaos. Contractors, 2 of them, who were converting the upper floors into habitable spaces that met residential program standards. A woman named Petra, who was going to run the program's day-to-day operations and who had an efficiency that Alara found immediately trustworthy. 3 children already placed, more coming, each of them arriving with some version of the same file. Limited prior history, placement history that started somewhere arbitrary, the particular closed-off quality of a child who had learned not to ask about the part of their life that came before. Alara met each of them on their first day. Not formally. She didn't think formal was the right register. She just made sure she was somewhere accessible. Somewhere the estate's kitchen or the east garden. Somewhere a child who wanted to talk could find her without it being an appointment. Most of them didn't talk the first week. That was fine. She understood the value of a week where you didn't have to talk. Vey came once, 6 weeks after the program opened. He came alone, no security visible, which meant security not visible was present somewhere on the grounds, and she let him have that. He walked the east garden with her in the morning light, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the property with an expression she'd learned to read as close to what other people might call feeling something. The children, he said. How are they? Adjusting, she said. It takes time. He nodded. They walked a little. Rennick's associates, he said. 2 of them were in the embedded list. They've been resolved. All of them? All of the ones on Harlan's list. She noted the precision of that answer. And Harlan's list, she said. Is it complete? He says so. And you believe him? Vey was quiet for a moment. I believe he understands his situation sufficiently to have no incentive to withhold. She thought about Harlan in the passage, sitting on a crate in the dark with a lantern and a plan that had contained too many variables and not enough honesty. She thought about his voice saying her name, Lara, with that compressed grief, the grief of someone who had made a decision that protected someone and destroyed them, and had spent 20 years living with the knowledge that those 2 things were true simultaneously. She had not forgiven him. She didn't think forgiveness was the accurate word for what was or wasn't happening with respect to Harlan. What she thought was that he was old, and that he would be watched, and that the things he knew would be extracted over time through the controlled negotiation Vey had arranged. And at the end of that process, he would be an old man who had done significant harm and significant service in roughly equal measure, and would die having been neither fully punished nor fully exonerated. She thought that was probably the most honest outcome available. She didn't say any of that to Vey. She thought he probably knew it. Whitfield's trial, she said. 6 months, they're estimating. There's enough documentation that it won't be contested at the evidence level. His counsel is going to attempt to frame the network as a legitimate intelligence operation. He paused. It won't work. You're sure? The 6 families' combined legal resources are ensuring that it won't work, he said, in a tone that was very neutral. Officially, of course, the families have no involvement in the trial. Of course, she said. They walked a little more. From somewhere inside the main house came the sound of 2 children arguing about something, the specific rhythm of a disagreement that was going to resolve itself without adult intervention if left 30 more seconds, which Alara judged and left. Vey stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He was looking at the groundskeeper's cottage. The outbuilding they'd emerged near, the night everything broke open. Someone had repaired the cottage's north-facing window that had been cracked in the firefight. New glass, same frame. You couldn't tell it had been broken unless you'd been there to see it break. "What you said in the ballroom," he said. "When I told you that you knew what the name meant, you said you didn't." "I didn't," she said, at that point. "But something was there," she said. "Yes. It had always been there. I just didn't have a way to reach it." She looked at the cottage. "I don't know that I have a complete answer for you about what it's like to carry something you can't access. I'm still working out how to think about it." He was quiet. "The scar," he said, after a moment, "the one on her cheek. You know how you got it." It wasn't quite a question. She touched it without thinking, the old habit. "Gray mantle," she said, "getting the children through. One of the passages had a collapsed section. I went through first to check it." She lowered her hand. "I don't remember it directly, but I know it." He nodded. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it the way the word is said when it's true and when the person saying it has decided they're going to say it without qualifications or addenda, just the thing itself. She stood with it. "I know," she said. They stood there a minute longer in the cold morning light of a spring that was still deciding to arrive, on the grounds of an estate that had been one thing and was becoming another, while inside the main house someone laughed. One of the children, a sound that arrived suddenly and then cut off as if surprised by itself. She started walking back toward the house. "Alara," Faye said. She stopped, looked back. He was still standing at the edge of the garden, and the morning light was on him, and he looked older than he'd looked in the ballroom. Or maybe she was just seeing him differently, without the formal atmosphere, without the crisis, as something closer to what he actually was, which was a man who had outlasted a lot of things and was not entirely at peace with how. "You chose this," he said, meaning the estate, the program, the specific shape of what she'd asked for over everything else they'd offered. "You could have—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I want you to know that I understand why." She looked at him. "Do you?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which she could see him doing. "No," he said, "not entirely." "I know who I was," she said. "What I did, at 8 years old, in that building. The child who went back for other children instead of running." She held his gaze. "I don't remember it, but I know it's true. And I don't want to spend whatever comes next trying to be something different." She glanced up at the main house, at the east-facing windows, at the thin column of smoke from the kitchen chimney where someone was using the wood stove against the cold morning. "I just want to be that, in a way that helps people who are still in the part I already got through." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and didn't say anything else, and she turned back toward the house. She walked up the east steps, pushed open the service door, the one she'd used 1,000 times, that opened now onto a kitchen that smelled of coffee and something baking and the practical human warmth of a space being used by people who needed to be warm. One of the children, a girl, 9 years old, with a file that contained very little about the first 4 years of her life, was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of orange juice and an expression of intense suspicion directed at her own reflection in the window. Alara hung up her jacket, poured a cup of coffee. She sat down at the table. The girl looked at her sideways. "The window does that," Alara said. "The angle. Makes you look different than you actually look." The girl considered this. "Different how?" "Like there's more going on," Alara said, "than there is." The girl thought about it, took a drink of her orange juice, looked at her reflection again. "Or maybe there's less going on," the girl said. Alara looked at her own reflection. Brief, sideways, the way you glance at something you've mostly made your peace with. "Maybe," she said. Outside, a car was starting somewhere on the grounds, Vey leaving the way he'd come, quietly and without ceremony. Inside, upstairs, footsteps crossed the floor above the kitchen. One of the contractors, or Petra, or another of the children beginning a morning that was theirs in a way that yesterday's hadn't been. Alara drank her coffee. The light through the east windows was thin and white and beginning to warm, and the ground stretched out beyond the glass toward the tree line and the old boundary wall and the sealed door in the passage below, which she had left open because some doors, once opened, should stay that way. The girl finished her orange juice and pushed the glass to the center of the table and sat back with the particular restless energy of a child who was between things, between the past that had brought her here and whatever the day was going to be. "Is there something to do?" the girl said. Alara looked at her. "Yes," she said, "there's a lot to do." She stood up, and the morning moved, and the estate breathed around them, and for the first time in 20 years, everything she was doing was something she had chosen.